not CPAs here, but we encourage you to take some time and reach out to your tax professional to get information that is more specific to your financial circumstances. But Chris, we are hoping that you can jump in and share with us a little bit about the tax credit and kind of where this is going.
Yes, and again, my limited knowledge, I did defer to our company, our corporate CPA, who kind of gave me a little tutorial on this. So again, I do give you that disclaimer that I am not in the business of financial advising, nor do I practice tax law. But we have some basic information to provide you. Again, I think throughout the slides you'll see some links to the IRS website. I strongly encourage you to go to those links. They provide a lot of information. But up front, first and foremost, is that the federal adoption tax credit. And I do emphasize that it is a credit. You will see, however, that potentially it could also result with a check in your hand should that credit be more than what your tax liability is. Again, this tax credit is pretty significant, and it has increased over the past couple of years. We have it on here on the slide. It's increased to $13,170 for 2010, and it is scheduled to sunset after 2011. They've indicated that it's going to revert back to only a tax credit if a special needs child is adopted beginning in 2012. Now, it's my understanding that there's been a lot of legislative support to make this adoption federal tax credit benefit permanent. We won't know that until we get there. So, you want to look at it as right now on the books. We know you have it for 2010 and you have it for 2011. We won't know until we get to 2012 whether they're going to adopt it again. So it is a tax credit. It is refundable, again, in situations where it balances out or leaves you more of a credit once your tax liability is absorbed. There are also, here in California, there is a state tax credit of, I believe it's up to $2,500. So you do want to check with your individual home state as to state benefits that may actually apply here as well for you. And
actually, yeah, if I can just interject real quick, Chris, I did here today, actually, this morning, in talking with some clients around financing. They were from Oklahoma and had just returned from meeting with their financial advisor, and they found out they had a significant tax credit available to them through their state. So I would also encourage everyone out there to make sure they look at their state benefits as well, because this was far and above beyond the federal tax credit available. So it was really significant. So I would again recommend you go check that out.
Yeah, if you're from Oklahoma, you should check it out right away. But I'm sure there are other states that will offer similar tax credits as well, and you're not going to know unless you check those out with a tax advisor. Moving on to the next slide, qualifying and filing for the adoption tax credit. Of course, you have to be eligible for the credit, so we have those outlined for you here. Adopt an eligible child, pay qualified adoption expenses. Okay, you'll see that on the IRS website throughout, and they actually do a mnemonic, QAE. You'll see that all over their website. So that means it has to be a qualified adoption expenses, paid out of your own pocket. Okay, and again, they can be taken for domestic special needs adoptions, even when the qualifying expenses don't reach the limit. So keep that in mind. There is a phase out. We'll touch on this in a little bit. For those of you who are in a higher income bracket, there will be a phase out of that. Now, keep in mind that it will apply to domestic and international adoptions, but procedurally they are quite different. Whereas international adoptions, the credit for expenses can be claimed only after finalization of that adoption. So you may be looking at quite some time before you can actually apply for that credit or take that credit. Domestic adoptions, however, the credit can be applied even if, well, first of all, can be applied before the adoption is finalized, but it also can be applied even if the adoption does not go through. Okay, God forbid there's a disruption and you have outlaid many expenses for that adoption opportunity. those can still be credited even if the adoption does not get finalized. Okay, we refer you to some forms here. I'm not going to highlight those too much, but those are, again, on the IRS website.
Chris, I do want to take you back to these qualified adoption expenses. You went over the expenses that are typically incurred in that adoption process. To your knowledge, and again, knowing that you're not a CPA or a financial professional, which of the adoption expenses that you discussed are eligible for that, for the credit?
Generally, and again, they use generally kind of vague terms in the IRS as well, but reasonable and necessary adoption expenses, meaning that they are directly related to the legal adoption of an eligible child. Any court costs and attorney's fees, of course, will play a role in the tax credit and be qualified. Travel and lodging, including you having to eat out while you are away and waiting for the placement of that child. So those are most, and of course, birth mother expenses for the most part will be included in that. But again, it's got to directly relate to the legal adoption. So it's broad, it's a little vague, but again, refer to your tax advisor when you are ready to take the credit, and he will be able to outline what is qualified and what is not. Okay. So again, keep in mind the difference between international and domestic. If you're counting on a credit and it working for you at an international adoption, you might be waiting for quite some time. So going to the next slide, the calculating qualified adoption expenses, we outline some of those, what it covers, the $13,170. So I will say most persons going through a domestic adoption process will pretty easily meet that tax credit of $13,170. It is per child, not per year. So if you are claiming expenses paid out over more than 1 year for one adoption, you still can meet up to the maximum credit amount. So keep that in mind. And again, you want to keep track of all your expenses. We do that here at ANLC, all expenses that relate to your adoption, so that you have a printout of that from us when you are ready to go to your CPA. Keep in mind, you do have to credit back to yourself any expenses that are reimbursed or paid for by your employer or any government agency or organization. So you don't get to double dip, if you will. So keep that in mind. When can you go ahead and claim your adoption tax credit under the IRS? Okay, now this can get a little confusing, but it's more procedural than anything else. So the year that you claim your adoption credit really can depend on when it is finalized. Now, with international, of course, it does depend absolutely on when the adoption is finalized. For domestic adoption, okay, you may have a situation where you paid adoption expenses. Let's say a client comes on board with us in 2008, and they pay us a marketing fee in 2008. Okay, that's an adoption expense related to a legal adoption. Then in 2009, they are in the process of adopting a child. So they pay more expenses in 2009. They actually finalize in 2009, but some of their expenses carry over into 2010. So what you need to know in that scenario is, again, expenses paid in 2008, child adopted in 2009, okay, and expenses take you over to 2010 as well. Okay. The expenses you incurred in 2008 can be taken on the 2009 tax return. Okay. The reason being is they have to be taken in the tax year, the same year that the adoption is finalized, okay, for domestic. So even though they occurred the year prior, you can take them in the year that follows when the adoption is finalized. Obviously, your 2009 expenses are going to be taken in that same tax year because that is also when the adoption is going to be finalized. And then 2010, if you have following expenses, maybe further expenses paid out that went from you were paying to the end of 2009 and then you paid some more expenses in early 2010, then you will take those 2010 expenses on that same tax year, 2010. So again, that example is a little bit complicated because you have 3 different years where expenses were incurred. Just keep in mind that in that example, your 2009 adoption expenses include costs you incurred both in 2008 and in 2009, and that's the year you will take them in. So this outline here, hopefully it doesn't confuse you too much, but for expenses paid before the adoption is final, you take the adoption credit the year after your expenses were paid. Okay? So for expenses paid in the same year the adoption is final, you're going to take it the same year. So that's why I set up the scenario 2008, 2009, and 2010. Okay? And again, we refer you to a link with the IRS regarding getting your child, adopted child, a adoption tax ID number. Very, very important. Many people want to run and try and get a Social Security number. You won't be able to do that until your adoption is finalized. You want to be able to go and get a tax ID number for that child, and then you can begin claiming your child as a dependent and providing the information to your tax advisor. Okay, I did touch lightly on the fact that there is a phase-out range for your adjusted gross income, where, of course, this will limit the application of the federal adoption tax credit. So we've outlined the progression there from 2006 up to 2000. I'm sorry, we just have 2010, and it actually has now upped the range from $182,520 to $222,520. So each year it's kind of crept up a little bit since the past 5 years. So again, this credit is reduced based on your modified adjusted gross income. So we refer you to a couple of links there with the IRS. I'm not going to belabor this point, but again, your tax advisor will know your phase out and whether you fall within that range based on your adjusted gross income. So that's the one limitation there that you have to keep an eye on.
Okay, and then the next area of opportunity to kind of help you mediate, if you will, those adoption expenses is benefits that are offered through your employer. And this is something that some people lose sight of or don't even stop to think about, that there are many employers out there that offer adoption benefits. And so